Well, I'm not. If I look at that, you're right in that in many ways you would like to match the elastic modulus with that of the bone. But if you look at the case of the mandible, the elastic modulus of the bone is typically 15, 20 gigapascals. And if you think the cancellous bone structure, you're down at less than 1 gigapascal. Yet we happily put titanium into that system with an elastic modulus of 120 gigapascal. So this is a factor of 10 higher already. So zirconia, you're going a factor of 20 higher. Secondly, if you look at the orthopedic area, we've been putting metal implants into the body for years. Chrome cobalt, which is virtually the same elastic modulus as that of zirconia. If they're designed properly, and we don't get stress shielding of the surrounding bone structure, then these are excellent. Some people who've had a Chanley hip, which is chrome cobalt system, 40 years in their system. Excuse me. So I'm not so concerned about that. My major concern is the design of how the implant is placed, and secondly, the issue in terms of you always get some bone recession around the upper part of that. Does that expose the threads of the zirconia? Does that lead to sort of this stress-enhanced transformation? In fact, I was in Geneva last week and visited Suzanne Shearer, and she showed me 2 examples of zirconia implants that are completely fractured. Why? The thread, where that sharp thread was, a crack had initiated from that, particularly for companies that are now trying to make a roughness surface on that to sort of have better bone ingrowth into that system. This predisposed that material to a much higher stress concentration, and that fractured in less than 2 years. Not the interface with bone, but straight across through that material, through the thread, that system. So where that thread sharp is, there's a stress concentration, there's some bending component there, completely through the system, on 2 implants that were adjacent to one another. Very disturbing for the company involved. Yes?
Well, this about strongness, does the thin bits on fight
for inlays and onlay systems, no, you usually have a thinner section of material. You're usually talking about porcelain by itself. You can, if you rapidly quench those systems, you could get residual stresses into those materials. So you could build residual stresses like we're talking about in those systems. But usually they are much thinner than the structures that we're talking about, particularly where you've got 3 to 4 millimeters of total section. You would rarely have that degree of thickness in an inlay or an onlay system. So I think under those conditions you would not get the magnitude of residual stresses that we're talking about in the case of zirconia. Yeah, your second question. Well, there's a couple of features there. The zirconia abutments are going to have the same problem we talked about, and some of those chippings that you saw that I showed were classically on abutments on zirconia systems, on titanium. There is another issue that is really the interaction between the titanium and the zirconia, particularly at the interface where these things rub and the like. The other feature that we've noticed is that we've actually looked at some of these abutment systems, and we've actually looked at those surfaces and then looked at them after 1 year in the mouth. And we find the monoclinic zirconia is increasing over that period of time. So this material is metastable in the mouth. And we've gone from essentially no monoclinic being seen in that system before, and then after 18 months or 12 months, something like 3 to 4% increase in monoclinic. It's small, but it's certainly measurable, and we can identify it relatively straightforward. So the question then becomes, if this is a thin section, Is this going to cause a strength degradation to that system? How long is that going to take place before it becomes a problem, before the material fails? It may not. It may be 50 years before it's a problem, which in most cases it will not be a problem at all. The patient will be often dead in that period of time. But, it will depend upon the conditions under which that is done. And for instance, some zirconias are much more stable in terms of this water-induced metastability problem that I spoke about. Others, particularly if they're sintered at high temperatures, are a little bit more prone to this process because the grain size is bigger and therefore it's more metastable. Yes? The word? Hipping. Hot isostatic pressing. Hot isostatic pressing is the process that occurs with all orthopedic hip joints. And what happens there is that after it's sintered, it is then taken and put into another furnace. This furnace is heated up to maybe 50 degrees centigrade below the centering temperature, but now it's subjected to very high pressures, typically something like 200 megapascals of nitrogen or argon, and this then squeezes that material to remove the final porosity in that system. So the consequence of that is that the strength of that material is increased because the defect sizes have been greatly reduced. For instance, sometimes in the pressing process, when these press the powders, they can cause small little shear delamination or shear laminations and other defect structures that occur. And now when it's sintered, those defects are not removed. But by now moving it into a hot isostatic pressing, you can squeeze and remove those final defects out of the system. Now this is very also common in metals. They will do this for titanium, for implants, particularly for orthopedic implants. Again, to try to remove those last small amount of defects in that system. They don't, at the moment it is occurring in orthopedic systems. I am not sure whether this is occurring with dental implants. It costs money and can almost double the price of the system because you have to eventually do another complete cycle of firing in this furnace. Then the trouble is you have to do another one in oxygen because under the high pressure conditions it goes grey or slightly black, and now they have to heat it up again in oxygen to get it back to its original colour. So how much more are you prepared to pay? Or your patient prepared to pay? Yes?